We will get started in just a minute here. Give people time to trickle in. All right. Uh, Welcome everyone. There's some literal beefing going on in the chat. Uh, but that's and there's no reason to stop now. But you want to direct your primary attention to the video where our next presenter, David White, is about to enlighten us all. David White is a web developer, podcaster, and an acknowledged authority on lucrative bogs. He lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with his wife, two cats, and, uh, as with us all, an ever-growing pile of books and Lego. And David, you say your favorite dumpling is kimchi's pierogi. Why don't you explain what that is and then jump into your talk?
It is exactly what it sounds like. It is a pierogi filled with kimchi and cheddar cheese, and it is delicious.
All right, well, David, take it away.
All right. Oops. So, off of Passamaquoddy Bay, off the Bay of Fundy, is Lubec, Maine, the easternmost municipality in the United States. If you were a resident of Lubec in 1897, you probably didn't notice when Hiram Comstock sold the tide-powered grist mill at Millard's Point at the end of October. You may have taken notice in December when the new owners threw up a barbed wire fence around the perimeter of the property. And you definitely noticed in January when they had a big new electric dynamo shipped up from Portland and then put up signs proclaiming the building to be plant number one of the Electrolytic Marine Salts Company. The newspapers would have had the full story about a week later. The Electrolytic Marine Salts Company was a consortium of Connecticut businessmen and the Reverend Prescott Ford Jernigan, who had discovered how to extract gold from seawater through the power of electricity. The old mill was to be the first of their tide mines. Now, you probably didn't care one way or the other. You didn't own any shares in the company. It had only recently gone on the market. You didn't know anyone who worked for it either. It had only a handful of employees, all of them out-of-towners who could be trusted with its trade secrets. You may have known a few of the contractors who had been hired to clear land nearby for a second tide mine. You did appreciate that the company's money was doing some good for the town's economy. It was making massive infrastructure improvements, like reinforcing all the bridges that came into town, installing its first telephone line. And they were also talking about building a new spur line off the railroad, putting up a new waterworks, building an electric power plant. If they ever got around to that, Lubec would start looking pretty nice. And you would have been utterly amazed when it all collapsed. The Reverend Jernigan disappeared without a trace. Plant number one was shut down. All the construction crews were laid off. By the end of the year, the Electrolytic Marine Salts Company was no more. What the hell happened? Let's start at the beginning. Prescott Ford Jernigan was born December 17, 1866, on Martha's Vineyard, the oldest son of Captain Jared Jernigan, a local whaler. As a boy, Prescott was both studious and mischievous, and he does not seem to have outgrown either trait. He graduated from Brown University in 1889 and from Newton Theological Seminary in 1892. He married his childhood sweetheart Betsy Finney shortly after and became the minister of the First Baptist Church in Middletown, Connecticut. Reverend Jernigan's primary influence was not the Bible, but Edward Bellamy's novel Looking Backwards, which depicted the United States of the year 2000 as a post-capitalist utopia. He attempted to use his position to put Bellamy's socialist ideas into practice by opening a co-op lumberyard, ministering to tramps and vagabonds, and throwing open the church doors to everyone, even if they weren't paying to rent a pew. These moves were not exactly popular with the Reverend Jernigan's well-to-do parishioners. They wanted a minister who would blandly reassure them that they were good Christians, not one who showed them up by actively trying to make the world a better place. They put up with Jernigan's malarkey for a few years, but in 1894 they put their feet down and slashed his salary. In response, he offered his resignation, thinking it was a hardball negotiating tactic, only to be flabbergasted when it was accepted. Jernigan quickly found another job, but this one was at the DeLand Baptist Church outside Daytona, Florida. He went down south to preach, while Betsy and the kids stayed behind. The good Reverend kept his head down in DeLand. He made no attempt to help the poor and needy, and his homilies were uncontroversial. His parishioners were not upset, but neither were they impressed. In 1896, they declined to renew his contract. Jernigan returned to Martha's Vineyard, where he immediately contracted typhoid fever. If he expected Betsy to take care of him, he was sorely mistaken. Instead, she declared she wanted a divorce, then decamped to Philadelphia to see the oculist she had been having an affair with. His mother and sister stepped in to pick up the slack. Several weeks of forced bed rest gave him time to think about his life. He did not like where it was going. He had dreamed of making the world a better place, but instead had been, quote, patronized by illiterate snobs. I had been underpaid. My mind had become embittered by 1,000 acts of injustice, unquote. Jernigan rose from his sickbed full of righteous anger. He was going to get what the world owed him, one way or another. He soon reconnected with a childhood friend, Charles Fisher, also recently returned to Martha's Vineyard. Fisher was a ne'er-do-well without a steady job. He had been a mill clerk and a floor walker for a department store, served as a soldier in the British Army, and scraped by for a few years as a submarine diver. He had been fired from several of those jobs for having sticky fingers, or in at least one case, quit right before he could get fired. Jernigan and Fisher were tailor-made for each other. They became partners in crime, pulling cons and scams on the good people of the vineyard. They were pretty small potatoes at first, though. Their biggest con involved selling shares in a company that bought rundown farm machinery, refurbished it, and resold it in the South. When shareholders realized that several months had gone by without promised financial statements and dividends, Jernigan and Fisher were nowhere to be found. They were eventually tracked down, but insisted that the company had gone under due to the failure of the tobacco crop. When it eventually emerged that the company had never actually been incorporated in the first place and certainly hadn't been purchasing farm equipment, it was only the good name of Captain Jared Jernigan that kept the duo out of jail. It helped that they hadn't yet spent their ill-gotten gains and used them to repay the marks. But then Prescott Ford Jernigan had a flash of inspiration. During his convalescence, his younger brother Marcus read magazines to him every day. An article in one of those magazines mentioned that particles of gold and silver had been discovered floating in the world's oceans. For some reason, that made him remember a visit to Block Island, where several of his Brown professors had set up the Seawater Steel Company, which used magnets to recover particles of scrap iron dumped into the ocean by nearby factories and mills. The company's process had technically worked, even if the iron was of inferior quality and turned out to be worthless commercially. Jernigan realized he could combine these two factoids into the ultimate con. What if there was a secret process that could be used to extract precious metals from seawater? I mean, obviously not magnets, gold and silver aren't magnetic, but maybe something chemical? Maybe electrical? Electricity was basically magic, right? That could work. A few months later, the Reverend Jernigan approached two Connecticut businessmen who had been his parishioners at the First Baptist Church, Arthur B. Ryan, a jeweler who taught Sunday school, and Andrew N. Pearson, a florist who was also a deacon. Picking the right mark is vital to any con. In this case, Jernigan's former parishioners remembered him as a holy man, an honest man, and as a utopian dreamer, and also as someone in a position of authority over them. That meant he was starting from a position of trust and respect, which would make it easier for him to sell his lies. And what lies they were. Jernigan told a fantastic tale that on a train ride back from Florida, Almighty God had parted the clouds and bestowed upon him a secret process to extract precious metals from seawater. He had spent a year making that vision a reality, and only recently had he perfected the gold accumulator. A good name can help sell a product, and as far as names go, Gold Accumulator is right up there with the best. Simple, direct, to the point. You may not know how it works, but you damn sure know what it claims to do. Jernigan's gold accumulator was just a small wooden box with slits in the side that allowed water to pass through, like a lobster trap. Inside the box was a lead pan filled with mercury and acids, connected to an electrical power source through platinum wires described variously as thick as a pencil or as thick as your pinky, so the width of a dainty finger or maybe an oversized novelty pencil. When the accumulator was lowered into the ocean, the tides would cycle seawater through the device, while the power of electrolysis would draw precious metals out of solution and bind them to the mercury. It cost pennies to build and run, and the return on investment was virtually infinite. Something for nothing is a classic con, and also a pretty obvious one, but it can work if your marks are blinded by greed. Ryan and Pearson were not blinded, at least not yet. They asked to see the accumulator in operation. Jernigan happily agreed, and to show them that he was on the level, he handed over the blueprints and insisted that they build their own accumulator. All he would provide was a location for the test and the electricity. That should have been another warning sign. When a magician lets you inspect him, it's because what you're inspecting is not key to the trick. One night, in February 1897, Jernigan, Ryan, and Pearson met in a dockside shack a few miles south of Providence, Rhode Island. Jernigan took Ryan and Pearson's accumulator, hooked it up to his power cables, and slowly lowered it into the dark waters of Narragansett Bay. They sat around making idle chit-chat for 12 hours through a complete cycle of the tides. Then they raised the accumulator out of the water and opened it. Jernigan was the first one to peer inside and nearly fainted and fell off the wharf. Turns out the lead pan had leaked and some of the mercury had been washed away, along with any precious metals that might have bonded to it. The Reverend recovered from his shock, took what little mercury was left, and gave it to his potential investors. They took it to a local chemist who did a quick assay and recovered 5 grains of gold and 10 grains of silver, worth about $4.50. The two capitalists did some quick back-of-the-envelope math using figures Jernigan had provided earlier. A single accumulator produced $6.50 in gold over the course of 60 hours. Operating costs were about 10 cents for every dollar of precious metals you recovered. An accumulator that ran continuously for a year would produce $949 of revenue or $854.10 of profit. In modern money, that's $32,216 per accumulator per year. Jernigan smiled and asked them, were they in? You bet your sweet bippy they were. They were all in. But first, let's take a moment to do a quick reality check. Or maybe a terminology check. I don't want to have to say precious metals or gold and silver all the time, so I'm just going to say gold from now on. If you could quietly add silver to that in your head, that would be great. And now a quick reality check. Is there actually gold in the ocean? There absolutely is. Scientists had long suspected it, and Edward Sonstadt and Archibald Liversidge had confirmed that hypothesis in 1872. Can you use electricity to separate gold from seawater? Absolutely can. That's basically what electroplating is, using an electrical current to separate metallic ions from a salt solution and depositing them onto a negatively charged cathode. So was the gold accumulator actually viable? No. A cubic mile of seawater weighs about 5 billion tons. That's mostly liquid water, but about 3.5% of that is various solids in suspension. Some 85% of that is salt, and another 14% is common elements like magnesium and bromine. The remaining 1%, or 1.6 million tons, is everything else. And some of that is gold. That's a trace amount at best, but even trace amounts can add up when you're talking about something as large as the ocean. Even conservative estimates suggest that there are hundreds of millions of tons of gold in the ocean, representing about $800 trillion at current market value. But mind you, that mother lode is still spread out across the entire ocean. It would be commercially viable to mine gold from the ocean if there were at least half a grain, or 32 milligrams, in every metric ton of seawater. In other words, gold needs to be a mere 3% of the ocean, which is not a lot. Part of a good con is mixing truth with fiction. So in 1897, all of the scientists was still relatively new, and so someone checking out the gold accumulator would have every reason to think this was perfectly feasible. The problem is that the actual concentration of gold in the ocean is only 0.000000001%, a whole order of magnitude lower than the break-even point. So, how had the gold accumulator extracted $4.50 of gold from the water of some Narragansett Bay? It hadn't. The conmen had salted the accumulator, preloading it with gold for Ryan and Pearson to find later. It's not clear exactly how. It was first suggested that Fisher, drawing on his diving experience, had slipped beneath the wharf under cover of darkness, used the electrical cable as a guide, and tipped gold dust into the submerged accumulator. In Jernigan's memoirs, he denied this version of events. He claimed Fisher had nearly drowned on a test dive and refused to try again. Instead, it was the Reverend who made a distraction when the accumulator was opened and used that opening to sprinkle in a few gold flakes he had been hiding in plain sight on an ornamental stick pin. And even that story may have been a lie. Really, all the conmen had to do was swap out the mercury from the accumulator with a pre-prepared sample before it could be assayed, and they had numerous opportunities to do that. There is some debate as to whether Jernigan and Fisher knew their process didn't work or if they were faking it until they made it. I don't think it matters. In the best case scenario, they had already committed fraud once, were willing to commit a second fraud to hook investors, and continue committing fraud for as long as it took. And that was going to add up to an awful lot of fraud, no matter what their intentions were. Jernigan spent the next several months finding investors among his former parishioners and seminary classmates. On November 5th, 1897, those investors incorporated the Electrolytic Marine Salts Company in Portland, Maine. Ryan was elected company president and received a small salary. The only compensation the other four officers received was a single share of company stock and a 25% commission on any stock they personally sold. Jernigan and Fisher were not officers, but employees, so they did receive a salary, plus a 45% royalty on every share sold, plus cash bonuses and stock grants when the company reached certain milestones. The company issued 10 million shares of stock, each valued at $1. Within days, they had already sold 250,000. That cash was used to buy an old tide-powered grist mill in Lubec on the theory that the Bay of Fundy's extreme tides would cycle more water and therefore more gold through the accumulators. Pearson spent several months renovating the old mill to meet the company's present needs and reopened it as Plant Number 1, the first of the company's so-called tide mines. The lower level of the plant was an orderly arrangement of gangplanks right at the tide line, dotted with small bays where the accumulators were lowered into the bay. The accumulator had gone a slight redesign. The wooden boxes were replaced by metal kettles, 3 feet in diameter and 2 feet tall. The lead pans were replaced by copper pans, which held up better to the acid, and they were hardwired to a dynamo on the upper level. Each accumulator would spend 30 days underwater and then be hauled up to clean out and refurbished for its next go-around. The mercury was taken upstairs to a laboratory where an on-site chemist separated out the gold and formed it into cones and bars for sale. Jernigan and Fisher were the plant's general manager and assistant manager. The only other full-time employees were chemist William Arrington, an engineer who maintained the dynamo, and a night watchman who was an old army buddy of Fisher's and therefore could be trusted not to ask questions. By February of 1898, Plant Number 1 was fully operational with 100 accumulators working around the clock and plans to expand to a full suite of 240. In March, a few gold bars began trickling down to Boston, and within weeks there was a steady stream. So, if the accumulator didn't work, where was this gold coming from? Simple. Jernigan and Fisher were buying it from jewelers in Portland, Boston, New York, and points beyond. Then they would ship it back to Lubec, grind it into gold dust, and sprinkle it into the accumulators at night when no one was around. Now, if your goal is to make money selling gold, that is a terrible strategy. Jernigan and Fisher were not making money selling gold. They were making money selling stock. As long as they were spending less on gold than they were making from stock sales, everything was hunky-dory. Mind you, the instant stock sales began to falter, they would be in serious trouble. The success of Plant Number 1 emboldened the directors to release a prospectus. It was full of some incredible hyperbole. Excuse my salesman voice here. There is enough gold in the waters of Long Island Sound to pay off the national debt and leave a larger gold reserve in the treasury than the government has yet possessed. The waters that sweep in and out of New York Bay daily contain enough gold to buy all the ships and merchandise borne on their surface. Massachusetts Bay holds enough of the precious metal to buy all the real and personal property in the entire state. If this thing continues, we shall presently be paving Earth streets with gold long before we reach the New Jerusalem. By the beginning of summer, the Electrolytic Marine Salts Company had mined nearly 2,800 ounces of gold valued at $20,000. Over 900,000 shares of stock had been sold, and the share price had risen to $1.40. The company even declared a 3% dividend and began clearing the land for a second tide mine that would double their capacity and revenues. The wheels were about to come off, though. Jernigan had become so famous he was getting recognized on the street, making it hard for him to secretly acquire gold. One week, he just couldn't get any, so the plant's output dropped to almost nothing. The board of directors began asking Fisher awkward questions, which he kept deflecting until an eavesdropping local suggested that heavy rains had diluted the waters of the bay, lowering the concentration of gold, and he seized on that comment as his easy out. But if the con men were having trouble getting enough gold to keep up the ruse at plant number 1, they were going to be in serious trouble when plant number 2 became operational. Stock sales were also beginning to slow down, meaning the directors were making less money on commission. Other capitalists had begun offering to buy gold accumulators from the company for outrageous sums. Eventually, one of the directors would succumb to temptation and agree, which would expose the entire con. The real trick to a successful con is getting out just before the collapse, so it was time to cut and run. On July 20th, Charles Fisher did not show up for his shift at plant number 1 and could not be found anywhere in Lubec. The locals were not particularly worried. He had always been a bit of a loner and figured he would turn up eventually. Then, on July 23rd, Prescott Ford Jernigan and his family quietly boarded the SS Navarre and set sail for France. No one had any idea something was amiss until July 25th, when the weekly shipment of gold arrived in Boston, accompanied by personal checks for each director totaling $9,500, and a slightly worrying letter from Jernigan to Ryan. My dear Ryan, I feel something has gone wrong with Fisher. He has disappeared from New York after telling me that the apparatus was ruined and has carried away the formula relating to the making of the machine in combination, which was his own invention and made since the initial contract, and which I have been pressing him to make clear to me and deposit a record of. His action in this regard leads me to fear that he may have deceived me, even in the experimental stage. Since I now look back, I see he was situated where he could do so in every experiment that has been successful. That the Maine machine takes gold out of seawater is a certainty. I shall devote myself for a few weeks in trying to find him, and whether I succeed or fail, I give you my word of honor that I will meet you for a conference in the near future. I advise that the directors develop a rigid scientific test, one in which our own apparatus is shown to be practical. Ever yours, J. Ryan was confused. Was Jernigan now claiming that Fisher had invented the gold accumulator? That Fisher had fled without divulging the secret of formula? Which may have never worked in the first place? But no, it definitely did work. Don't worry too much about that. What the heck was going on? Ryan set off for Lubec to find out. To calm the market's fears, he announced that Fisher had gone on a belated honeymoon and that Jernigan was traveling to Europe to acquire the chemicals and machinery needed for plant number 2. They were definitely lies, and he knew it. And within a day, so did everyone else, because the papers began running an expose of the Electrolytic Marine Salts Company by William Phelan. Phelan was one of the first potential investors the conmen had approached, and had even been in the room for Ryan and Pearson's test of the gold accumulator. Phelan chose not to invest because he smelled something fishy. He launched a private investigation into Jernigan and Fisher, and eventually discovered the true nature of their scam. He also named 4 other individuals who were in on it. Ryan, the company president, who was named in prospectus as one of the people who knew how the accumulator worked. Arrington, the chemist, who was responsible for assaying the gold, the company's accountant, who had to be hiding Jernigan's surreptitious gold purchases, and for some reason, the contractor building plant number 2. There was an enormous public outcry, and Ryan was forced to halt trading in the stock, shut down operations at plant number 1, and pause the construction of plant number 2. Arrington was dragged down to police headquarters and charged with conspiracy to defraud, with bail set at $25,000. A message was telegraphed across the ocean asking European authorities to keep an eye out for Prescott Ford Jernigan. Jernigan and his family arrived at Le Havre on August 1st. He was briefly questioned by the French police, but could not be detained because he had yet to be charged with a crime. The Sûreté promised to keep an eye on him, and then immediately lost track of him somewhere along the road to Paris. Ryan quickly discovered that Jernigan and Fisher had taken between them some $250,000 in cash. He would not call it embezzlement. Instead, he insisted that this was money that Jernigan and Fisher were entitled to, their royalties from the sale of stock. As far as he was concerned, everything was still on the up and up, even if the two most important people in the operation had fled the country and disappeared without a trace. The market did not agree, and when trading resumed, the company's share price plummeted from a buck 40 to 30 cents. Ryan began to do damage control, claiming that Jernigan and Fisher had been targeted by a gang of sharpers and had fled the country to escape them. And amazingly, this was true. They were being blackmailed by one William Phelan. Phelan had not been approached to be an investor, he had been approached to be an accomplice. He was an old army buddy of Fisher's, a notorious counterfeiter, and an accomplished submarine diver. He was supposed to have assisted Fisher's dives, but when that part of the plan was scrapped, he was let go. When he realized how successful his former accomplices had become, he began demanding large sums of money, which they refused to pay, and fled the country. The police promptly released Arrington from jail and began hunting down Phelan, who then rode over to New Brunswick to escape prosecution. Meanwhile, Ryan's investigation turned up some troubling stuff. He learned about Fisher's sticky fingers and Jernigan's farm machinery scam. He discovered that they had not made spur-of-the-moment decisions to flee the country, but had made travel plans weeks earlier under assumed names. Jernigan had used other assumed names to open bank accounts all over New York and launder his funds. He had even bumped into friends on the way to board the Navarre and tried to gaslight them into thinking he was someone else. The disgruntled investors began demanding something be done, but nothing could be done according to the regular rules of order. Over the summer, the grateful directors had spontaneously gifted Jernigan and Fisher the remainder of the unsold stock, some 9 million shares, giving them a 90% controlling interest in the company. No quorum could be met without them, and they could control the outcome of any vote anyway. And yet, in spite of all this, Ryan and the other directors refused to consider the possibility they had been duped. They brought top scientists to Lubec to try and make the gold accumulators work, who all agreed that the basic principle was sound, but that the devices would never be economically viable. The directors refused to believe them, too, even after an electrical engineer pointed out the embarrassingly obvious fact that the accumulators had never been getting any power. There were wires that went into a junction box from the dynamo and wires that came out of it, but they were not actually connected to each other inside it. By now, Fisher had completely vanished. Jernigan was hiding out somewhere in Europe, but popped up every few weeks to write letters to the press, disavowing any personal responsibility and shifting the blame to Fisher. Ryan had no choice but to throw in the towel and put the company into receivership. But he had a few lucky breaks. They found $34,000 of bullion locked away in an office at the plant. Jernigan had given bonds worth $55,000 to his brother, who turned them over to the authorities once he realized what was going on. And another $43,000 was recovered from bank accounts he'd forgotten about. Even the conmen's homes and furniture were seized and sold. And the luckiest break of all, over in Europe, Jernigan had gambled away half of his ill-gotten gains, and it had given him a new perspective. Stricken with remorse, he offered to return the $75,000 he had left to the company on one condition, that he not be prosecuted for fraud, and the directors gladly agreed. In the end, the company's creditors received 41 cents on the dollar. That's pretty good for a worthless company, all things considered. And that was the end of the Electrolytic Marine Salts Company, but not the end of Prescott Ford Jernigan and Charles Fisher. We'll do Fisher first because his life was a lot shorter. He fled to New Zealand, then New South Wales, and died of a sudden illness in Sydney in 1902. It was later rumored that he had faked his death and was living in the South Pacific, or had be until he was caught in flagrante delicto with a cannibal chief's wife and beheaded. In 1899, Jernigan's wife left him to return to America and file for divorce. Jernigan kicked around the continent until he ran out of money, then snuck across the pond and took whatever job he could find. He worked on a labor gang in Manitoba, went prospecting in Alaska, and ran a sawmill in Washington. He eventually wound up in the Philippines, where he became a teacher, wrote several textbooks, and may have even written lyrics to the Philippine national anthem. He then relocated to Hawaii, where he became a high school principal. When his story was forgotten, he returned to the United States and lived in obscurity in California before dying in 1942 while visiting one of his daughters in Texas. And that, my friends, is the story of the Electrolytic Marine Salts Company of Lubec, Maine.
All right. Thank you very much. We have some time left for questions. There's already a few in the chat. Very vigorous chat going on. Let's see. We have a question from Ethan who asks, did Lubec have any other industry before the company came in? Did the locals really have no objection?
I mean, it's mostly a coastal town in Maine, so all the industry is going to be mostly fishing and whaling. And it's the 1890s, so whaling's pretty dead by then. So it's mostly going to be fishing and whatever industry is left to support the local agricultural economy. So obviously they had a tide-powered grist mill, so they had enough farms to mill wheat. But no, they did not really have a lot of heavy industry. They did have some import-export stuff because they are literally just a short rowboat ride from New Brunswick.
Uh, uh, Ethan and others have pointed out you can't just leave us hanging in that Philippine national anthem thing. You gotta finish that.
I've seen that claim repeated, and I can't elaborate on it much more on account of it does not seem to be the current Philippine national anthem, which I'm assuming probably changed in the 60s. Uh, so I'm assuming it must have been an early version of the Philippine national anthem shortly after the Spanish American War. That's all I can think of.
All right. If anyone else has any questions, drop it in the chat. We've still got about 10 minutes left for questions. Uh, let's yeah. So I mean, it seems like there's certain periods in American life where you hear more of these stories about hucksters and con men than others. Was this sort of its time? Was there a lot of this
Oh,
stuff going on?
yeah, the late 19th century and early 20th century is just like that period from about 1870 to about 1920 is probably the golden age of cons. People are just constantly, uh, you know, robbing people blind and then just picking up and moving to the next town where no one's heard of them. It's it's remarkably easy to change your name and not have anyone be able to track you down.
Was that just a case that technology was changing so quickly then that anything's impossible, but the bureaucrat administrative state hadn't caught up?
That's part of it. Yeah, like it's especially like, you know, no one really knew what electric like even today people think computers can do just about anything. So just imagine that like sure electricity can do this. Why can't it do it? It allows me to talk to my uncle who lives on the other side of the country for God's sakes. Why wouldn't it be able to extract gold from seawater or bring things back to life?
Uh, Ethan asked whether stuff like the Sherman Act, were things like were there laws that were responding to small time cons, as much as sort of the big trusts and monopolies?
I don't think that was necessarily on their mind when they were doing the Anti-Truck Act, but um, yeah, I think Rick's comment here that yeah, the level of communication was right that the idea could spread without necessarily spreading out of a small area, so you could kind of control the narrative. Uh, like a lot of cons you read, like they collapse as soon as the information like spreads to the next city, and people are like, "Wait, that was the guy who tried to sell us all those chickens last week, and they turned out to all be dead." You know, like that's the sort of thing you would have. Like you were just basically outrunning the telegraph.
Uh, yeah. Let's see. Any other questions in the chat? Who would you cast in if you made a movie about this in the lead roles?
Oh, geez, it's got to be someone who's like he looks like someone who's got to be someone who looks like he's just been beaten down by like idealistic and beaten down. I don't know if I'd do Defoe. I'm thinking Sam Rockwell actually because he does good like used to be idealistic and now has just been sort of ground down and resigned to his fate. Fisher,
Directed by the Coen brothers, I assume.
yeah, probably. Fisher's a hard one just because all Fisher has to do is look relatively skeevy and hang out in the background. It would be a good role for someone who doesn't mind being in a small one. I want to say Robert Pattinson, but that like he's always good in roles like that.
Uh, let's see. So I think I may have neglected to mention when introducing you that your podcast is the Ancient Esoteric Order of the Jackalope, or your project rather.
Yes.
Uh, so feel free to want to talk a little bit about your promote your show as we wait for the last chance for people to get questions in.
It is a podcast devoted to the idea that that which is least known is best to know. That's pretty much it. It's other podcasts may be themed, and I'm more like the guy who corners you at a party to talk about the book he just read, like it's really fascinating, and he won't shut up about it. This is me doing that instead of cornering people I actually know at parties and boring the shit out of them. I can bore the shit out of the whole internet.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. So, David White, thank you very much for this uh, startling tale of credulity and deception.
Thank you very
Uh,
much for having me.
there is we've got a couple more talks scheduled for the final uh, session before the last plenary. We have religion lol, let's play, and the partial historians. Uh, so go pick out whichever one of those seems most interesting. And some of you, if you're seeing the partial historians, I'll be seeing you again in a few minutes.